video is a condensed demonstration debate, so you can begin seeing some of the ideas we've been talking about in action. This debate was produced by the Atlanta Urban Debate League, and we are thankful to them for letting us incorporate it into our Introduction to Debate series. The speech times are reduced, and the speed of delivery is less than you would find at a typical debate tournament, but it does highlight a lot of the argument genres and ways to refute your opponents we have discussed so far. Enjoy.
Great. Plan. The United States federal government should increase diplomatic and economic engagement with the People's Republic of China that invites them to join the Trans-Pacific Partnership, making clear to the Chinese government that they are not excluded, can meet standards, and are encouraged to apply for membership. Contention 1 is inherency. China is not in the Trans-Pacific Partnership now, Wang, a professor of international affairs in 2016. The TPP does not include China, which is a genuine Pacific nation and also the world's largest exporter. There is no sign that the PRC will be a part of the TPP anytime soon. Contention 2 is our advantage, containment. First, China explicitly sees the TPP as an element of containment, Aneja in 2.6. China's foreign ministry spokesman urged relevant countries to not politicize economic trade issues. Liu was responding to remarks by Obama that the TPP allows America and not countries like China to write the rules. Second, containment risks war. Including China in the TPP is key to prevent war. Kroeber 15. At root is a deep ambivalence about whether or not the United States should accept China. Such a strategy heightens the risk of armed conflict. China and the US still mostly conduct their relations on a basis of economic pragmatism rather than strategic rivalry, but the ground is rapidly shifting. TPP sharpens the question of how the US and China will share power, and a US and China war would go nuclear straight times in 2000. The high-intensity scenario postulates a cross-strait war escalating into a full-scale war between the US and China. It raises the probability of a nuclear war. Contention 3 is solvency. Including China is key to trade. The plan boosts cooperation between the two countries. Greenville 16. Multilateral trade is optimal. They estimate that TPP would raise annual world income by $1.9 trillion if an all-inclusive Asia-Pacific grouping could be achieved. The obvious omission is China. Rhetoric in relation to China has been ambivalent, even unwelcoming. Ready for cross-ex.
The plan is solely unilateral, i.e. the US overtly asking China to join the TPP, correct?
Yeah, but that process would engage in cooperation with China and negotiations with China over joining the TPP.
Do other countries like Japan and South Korea support Chinese inclusion?
Well, our argument is that we can make China less aggressive by including them into the TPP. So even if you're right that they don't like China now, the plan makes them like China more.
Since the US and China currently have $1 billion worth of trade relations, why would, in the case that China didn't markedly increase their trade through the TPP, why would they go to war with the US?
Well, our Straits Times evidence says that political issues often overwhelm economic issues as it relates to war. So even if there's economic interdependence or trade, there are political issues that would go to war over that matter more than economics.
Everybody ready? Alright. Order is going to be the appeasement disad, then case. Is that fine? Alright. Uniqueness. US-Japan alliance is strong but fragile. Glosserman et al. In 2015. We're stepping up work with the Japanese and South Koreans. We're also saying that there's a deployment of new army, artillery, batteries that they're sending out. What our allies need to be expecting is a demand for the US for them to do more. You've got leaning forward politicians, economic dimensions of engagement in ways, I think, that reassure and provide a deeper strategic contention between these countries. And link Plan is appeasement. Giving China things unilaterally encourages aggression and scares Japan, which creates an Asian arms race. Jeanette Avery and Nickton in 2009. Perhaps the single most important factor to date is discussing Tokyo from developing a nuclear arsenal and the US guarantees to protect Japan's security. Most policymakers in Japan continue to emphasize that strengthening the alliance as well as shared conventional capabilities is a more sound strategy than pursuing an independent nuclear capability. Although the United States has reiterated its commitment to defend Japan, their strategic stakes have changed, leading some in Japan to question the American pledge. The most alarming consequences of a Japan decision to develop nuclear weapons would be the development of regional arms races. And impact. Asian proliferation leads to nuclear war. Symbala in 2015. The possibility of an inadvertent nuclear war or escalation to nuclear from conventional war was very real during the Cold War. This has carried the legacy forward into the post-Cold War and 21st century world. Inside dope of the opponent's political thinking and military planning may be hard to come by under the exigent pressure of crisis. If the possibility existed of a mistaken preemption during the immediately after the Cold War between the experienced nuclear forces and command systems of America and Russia. And onto the containment advantage. China does not see the TPP as containment. Bashir in 2015 says China's leading trade policy intellectuals now say that they have fewer concerns that the pact could even help China by making it easier for Beijing to pursue its own regional agreements.
My first question is, how much influence militarily and economically does Japan have in East Asia?
Yeah, well, Japan is the third largest country by GDP per capita standards in the world. It also has nuclear power and the capability to manufacture nuclear weapons easily and, prolifically.
Okay, so that brings me to my next question. Your evidence says that the plan would scare Japan, but that evidence is not about the TPP. I'm curious why the TPP is relevant to Japan-US relations.
The TPP is substantial enough to send a signal to the Japanese nation or Japan in general to force them or want them to proliferate.
So Liliana asked me during 1EC CrossX about the fact that there's sort of trade that exists between China and the US now. Why didn't that scare Japan? Why is the plan different?
The TPP is substantial. It's comprised of a majority of the Pacific Ring countries and a substantial amount of the world's free trade and GDP.
Makes sense to me.
All right.
First, I'll be addressing the case, and then I'll be addressing the dissent. Okay. Wait, can I have time?
Case of inheritance containment.
Say that rundown again.
Yeah. First, I'll be answering the case arguments, then I'll be answering the disadvantage. The negative's first argument is that China does not view the TPP as containment. However, the 1AC Eurasia evidence indicates that the foreign ministry spokesman goes affirmative and agrees that China does indeed view the TPP as containment, which is the most qualified spokesperson on this issue. Here's more evidence. TPP promotes Chinese containment, Hearn and Myers in 15. The agreement is also described as a U.S. plan to undermine ASEAN Plus 3, an institution that has leveraged China's growth. A prominent foreign contributor to Chinese official media, John Ross, argues that the TPP aims to reorient trade discussion in the Pacific away from the most dynamic market, China, to the less dynamic one of the U.S. by setting terms which exclude China. They've also not answered any of the impact arguments of the affirmative, that you can extend the Straits Times evidence that indicates that absent the TPP, China war would escalate and cause a nuclear war. Now the disadvantage. First, an argument that Jamie makes in CrossX, existing US-China trade should have already triggered this disadvantage. There's no reason that the TPP is specifically key to cause to trigger the link. Now, assurance is failing now. Funding, distractions, China, Green in 16. Actions by countries in the region routinely challenge the credibility of US security commitments, and US capability development is not keeping pace with challenges by potential competitors, resulting in the balance of military power in the region shifting against the United States. First, the Obama administration still has not articulated a clear, coherent, or consistent strategy for the region, particularly when it comes to managing China's rise. Cuts to the defense budget from 2009 to 2015 have limited the Defense Department's ability to pursue the rebalance. Next, the plan helps the alliance and increases perception of U.S. involvement in the region, Tanaka in 15. The evolution in U.S.-Japan alliance relations has taken place as the regional balance of power shifts. Emerging economies such as China are rising. A change in the U.S. mindset is needed so it may truly act as a resident power in East Asia. Current projections are that Asia will be the home to 2/3 of the global middle class by 2030.
So you specifically reference your amnesia evidence from the 1AC stating that China would see the TPP as a form of containment, is that correct?
Yeah.
How is the one person that says the TPP is containment representative of Chinese political or economic or ideological thought?
Sure, so the amnesia evidence actually cites China's foreign ministry spokesman, which means that he's actually assigned to represent China's political stance on issues like this, which means that, yes, one person theoretically, in general, might not have that kind of standing,
Does he represent how the nation or the People's Republic of China would react to a policy like that?
Yeah, it certainly would, because he's informed by the government on what stance he should take or what he should tell the media, which means that a logical extrapolation is that that's how China would react to the TPP.
So Prime Minister Abe is currently attempting to dissolve the Japanese constitution and pushing Japan towards war. Does your evidence take into account that Japan is attempting to militarize? Seeing that's from a year ago?
The amnesia evidence obviously doesn't take into account whether or not Japan's alliance commitments are changing. It's just about containment.
The order is the disadvantage. Is everyone ready? The act goes out of its way to unilaterally include China in the TPP, sending the signal to Japan that the U.S. will no longer provide security guarantees and include it in major decisions. With rising South China Sea tension, Japan will have no choice but to proliferate. That's Chandler Avery. This will escalate into a regional nuclear arms race that spills over to hotspots like India and Pakistan, causing a global nuclear war that turns the app because it guarantees China war and destroys global trade. That's Simbala. They say that trade now should trigger the link, but the diplomatic aspects of the TPP send signals of appeasement. The act sends the perception that America is feeble, declining, and de facto endorsing China's aggressive strategy in the SCS. Even if they win that the plan isn't a total shift to appeasement, a marginal decrease in containment is sufficient to trigger the impact. They say non-unique, but the U.S. has ties with Japan and South Korea, but they're fragile now. We need to bolster that relationship to preserve strength. That's Glosserman. Their argument about U.S. funding only means that it is more important than ever to send a perception of U.S. strength. Now, they say turn, but increased U.S.-China engagement accelerates Japanese fears of decoupling, which damages the alliances and causes remilitarization. Glosserman 13. The biggest issue for the U.S.-Japan alliance is China. Washington and Tokyo must manage the impact of China's rise on their bilateral relationship. Japanese experts and officials voiced two concerns. The first is the fear of decoupling, that the U.S. and Japan are worried since President Bill Clinton overflew Tokyo twice on his way to and from Beijing. Japanese worry that they have been eclipsed by China and the U.S.'s preferred partner in Asia. Japanese experts and officials urge the U.S. to be more forward-leaning, actually backing Japan's claim to the islands as well as chastising China for threatening instability in the region. Japan feels threatened now by Chinese actions. This reflects a second difference, how the country ranks security threats. China tops Japan's list while the U.S. identifies North Korea as its immediate regional concern.
My first question is about the overview you give at the beginning of your speech. Why exactly does tension in Japan spill over to hotspots like India and Pakistan, who don't have the same geopolitical ties that countries in East Asia do?
Sure. Our Chandler Avery evidence indicates that if Japan were to feel threatened, i.e. would no longer think that they were backed by U.S. security guarantees, then they would feel forced to build up their own military, including proliferating nuclear weapons, which would send off the domino effect, start a domino effect throughout the rest of Southeast Asia, including countries like India and Pakistan, as they would proliferate as a result of Japan's proliferation.
I guess my question is, why India and Pakistan are proliferating in the status quo, or at least trying to. Why is it that Japan's commitment to prolif or not prolif is key to any kind of development
If
there?
the region in which India and Pakistan are already having tensions, if tensions were to escalate externally, like other countries surrounding them were to start building up nuclear military arsenals, then those countries would be more likely to escalate.
Order is going to be solvency, containment. Is everyone ready? There are two problems with the affirmative case. The first is that it is impossible to solve containment of China, and the second is that containment of China does likely not lead to a U.S.-China war. The first point is that they never read a claim that says China will say yes to this plan. And the second is that their Greenville in 2016 evidence clearly states that only by involving China in the TPP, we would increase economic ties, not cooperation. It's impossible to tell whether or not we can truly mend the ties of containment. Looking through their containment flow, there are three key problems. They say that Indonesia proves that TPP is containment, but Indonesia is not representative of the Chinese political structure or response to policy situations. Second is that their Kroeber in 2015, which says containment risks war, is non-unique. We've been containing China for the past 10 years, and there's no reason why it would escalate to into a conflict. And finally, there's no impact to China-US war. Social stratification and interdependence check that conflict. It is improbable to think that because we do not include China in a trade deal, they would go to war. Thank you.
The order is going to be the case and then the disadvantage. Is everybody ready?
Yes.
Great. They say that we're not able to solve containment, but that's not true. China would like the plan because they get economic benefits out of it, so they would say yes. They say that there's no impact, but there is an impact to China-US war. It would lead to nuclear weapons because it undermines economic relationship with the United States. Go to the disadvantage. They say that we cause a domino effect for countries to acquire nuclear weapons, but that impact doesn't make sense because there's no reason that countries like India or Pakistan would care about the TPP. Extend our first 2EC argument that existing trade should have already scared Japan, or it proves that the plan is just a drop in the bucket because it proves that previous instances of economic engagement did not freak out Japan. Now, also extend our turn, which is our third 2EC argument. Our evidence says that the plan increases the perception of US involvement in the region, and it tries to make China more peaceful, so Japan would obviously like the plan. We give the perception that we're more invested in security in the region, which actually strengthens the alliance with Japan.
The order is the disadvantage, then the case. The only impact left in this round is the disadvantage because it outweighs and turns the risk of China war coming from the act. The plan sends a signal of appeasement to China, to Japan, because the U.S. will be unilaterally offering China something that it wants without demanding anything in return. Japan will perceive this as the U.S. abandoning its security guarantees, meaning that they will no longer have an ally in the region to protect themselves against Chinese aggression and feel as if they have to escalate and proliferate themselves, which will spill over to nuclear conflict throughout the rest of the region. They say that the plan solves this, but the perception is that by Japan is that the U.S. is siding with China and not Japan, so they'll still feel the need to escalate. Their trade arguments only prove that there's no impact to the act because they can't win a collapse of trade absent the TPP, which means that if there's trade now, it'll preserve economic relations and not cause a US-China war regardless.
Okay, first I'll be extending the case and then I'll be answering the disadvantage. Extend the impact to the containment advantage. China war would escalate and draw in other great powers. This outweighs the disadvantage on magnitude because their impact scenario is nonsensical. There's no reason that Japan proliferation would extend to other hotspots or include any other powers than those in East Asia. Now the disadvantage. You should extend the argument that Jaden extends at the top of the 1AR, the link turn argument. By involving ourselves with China through the TPP, it would increase the perception of U.S. involvement rather than decreasing it, making China more peaceful, because it would send the signal that the U.S. is more involved in East Asia and therefore is even more committed to the alliance with Japan. This means that it wouldn't be perceived as an abandonment of our policies with Japan, but rather a strengthening of our commitment to the region, which has been lacking in recent years. The plan also is just a drop in the bucket compared to trade with China, which means that there's no unique reason that the TPP would cause any kind of anxiety or proliferation with Japan.